Good evening. I'm Mary Schmidt Campbell, and as the 10th president of Spelman College, I'm so pleased to welcome you this evening to Roots, Reclamation, and Resistance, the annual Food Justice Summit, organized and presented by Spelman's Food Studies program in conjunction with Food Tank. Our thanks to Spelman's Dr. Kimberly Jackson, the director of Food Studies, who has been the dynamic and inspired leader of food studies on our campus for over a decade. Our thanks to Food Tank for partnering with us as well, and a special thanks to Food Tank's Danielle Nierenberg. At Spelman, we refer to food studies as a movement as opposed to a program. And that's because we have faculty from disciplines in almost every division of the college who participate. They participate in the food studies minor, in programs like Tending Victory Garden, and these programs reach over 100 students with courses, co-curricular activities, and presentations like the one this evening. There are three big themes that tonight's presentation will cover. Roots, that is, how are Black women embracing the roots of diasporic food systems? Resistance, how are Black women resisting the current food systems through AI? Reclamation, how are Black women reclaiming food and land? As I thought about this program, I thought about my own roots. My grandfather was a farmer in Amelia County, Virginia. Every day, my grandmother would prepare the midday meal for the men working in the fields. And that meant I would watch her get up in the mornings, go out to the chicken coop, kill a chicken, douse it in boiling water, sit there and pick the feathers off with her hands, chop it up, and then cook it over a wood burning stove. In the meantime, she'd get us up out of our beds and get us into the garden to pick some tomatoes off the vine, gather up some lima beans, and she, all the while, would also be baking bread. And then the midday meal would arrive and everybody would come in from the fields and we'd all sit down and we would eat what we had grown and what we had prepared ourselves. There was not one store-bought item on that table. And as I recall these memories, I am sure that there are many stories like that in this Zoom room, because Black families in this country post-emancipation were overwhelmingly agrarian. So it's exciting to know now that resistance has emerged and that it has emerged in the form of technology and food, in particular, AI. And it's especially exciting here at Spelman because Spelman is the leading producer of Black women scientists. So along with our commitment to food studies, we're eager to join the resistance movement by seeing the marriage of two of our most resilient strengths. And finally, a thought that came to me as I prepared for this welcome was my inauguration as the 10th president of Spelman College. Some of you know that I'm about a few months away from retirement. But I find it striking that when I came into Spelman, Dr. Mona Phillips organized a series of seminars and sessions about Black women all over the country who were engaging in urban farms. They were building big, ambitious farms. They were building successful farms. They were the pioneers for this process of reclamation. So it seems especially fitting that having started my time here at Spelman with that seminar, that I'll be ending with this one. So I want to once again thank all of our speakers and guests, the food scholars, tech activists, entrepreneurs, food activists, everyone who has joined us this evening. You'll be moderated by one of Atlanta's most outstanding journalists, WABE's Rose Scott. And as I'm sure you know, your work is as restorative as it is invaluable. And I wish you all a productive summit. Thank you. And now to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schmidt Campbell. What an honor to meet you and to be a small part of the Spelman community. I love that you said that food studies is a movement and the importance of including science in how we think about food and agriculture. Again, I'm Danny Nierenberg. I am president and co-founder of Food Tank, and we're a research and advocacy nonprofit that is really devoted to highlighting stories of hope and success in food systems, both internationally and domestically. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Kimberly Jackson is the chair of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, an associate professor of biochemistry, and the director, as Dr. Schmidt Campbell said, of the Food Studies program at Spelman College. She is also an amazing human and has been a really incredible partner to Food Tank. We have been so honored and humbled to collaborate with Spelman College and are grateful for Dr. Jackson and her colleagues for their support and their partnership. Dr. Jackson, it's so great to see you. We've been putting tonight's agenda together together for a very long time now, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what excites you the most about this evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Danny, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, Dr. Campbell, for your wonderful welcome remarks. We're so excited to bring this event this evening to highlight the work of Black women food scholars and global change makers who are carving out spaces to make a more equitable and sustainable food system. At Spelman, we know that food has shaped our history and continues to shape our future. It is well documented through historical preservation and archival data that the first 50 years of the college are steeply rooted in food studies. So we're continuing the tradition. Our food studies program teaches Black women to lead the way and to be thought leaders in food-related fields. From courses on unequal distribution of food to my own food chemistry course, we've peeled back layers of inequality in federal policies, land ownership, Black women's labor, both productive and unrecognized, and food security. So food for us is center. We have an all-star lineup for you this evening. This evening, we will be hearing from food tech CEOs, a scientist, a cultural preservationist, a lawyer, chef, business owners. Two of our panels are honored as top 2022 Black women in food. But at the core, all of these women are activists. Like Dr. Campbell was mentioning, you'll hear about preserving African diasporic roots in agriculture, using technology to resist traditional food production practices, and reclaiming and retaining stolen land for Black farmers. So next, the way the program is going to go, we're going to have a fireside chat with Danny, the president of Food Tank, and Julia Collins. Then we'll have this wonderful panel featuring Gabrielle E. W. Carter, Riana, Lynn, and Tracy McCurdy, all moderated by Rose Scott. Now, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. You know, we have the chat box going and people are putting where they're from, so welcome from around the world. But if you have a question, make sure you use the Q&A box. And again, welcome to our annual Food Justice Summit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. And again, it's really such an honor to be partnering with you. It's now my sincere pleasure to introduce Julia Collins, the founder and CEO of Planet Forward. And Planet Forward is the foremost carbon management platform for consumer brands. And they leverage the largest life cycle assessment database for agricultural products and advanced value chain modeling to help companies reduce their carbon footprints. It's really game changing what Planet Forward and Julia are doing. And what I like most about Julia is that she is both hopeful about solving the climate crisis, while at the same time, she understands the urgency of the private sector's responsibility in addressing these issues and not making commitments just for 2050 or even 2030, but for today. And I think that's what's so important, that we make these commitments and we act on them. So Julia, it's so great to see you again. Thank you for being part of this event.
So great to be here with you, Danny. And thanks to Dr. Campbell and Dr. Jackson for those awesome opening comments.
So, Julia, when we talked about this conversation, we decided that we wanted to frame it around three main themes. And the first is why now? And so I want to ask you, why is it so necessary that right now we figure out how companies can reduce their carbon footprints, neutralize the carbon they're creating, and come up with new business models?
I probably don't have to tell this audience about the urgency of the climate emergency. My hunch is that every single person who is with us today understands it and even feels it at a visceral level. But often when I'm out doing my work in the world, I do have to let folks know about the urgency. One of the ways that I describe it is according to the time that we have to get the job done. So it is very much the case, Danny, that we have fewer than 100 months to reduce global emissions by 40%. And we are not currently on track to get there. The reason why it matters to deploy scalable solutions to addressing the climate emergency, including decarbonization, which is what my company is all about, the reason why it's so critically important to deploy that technology now is that emissions reductions are more important now than they've ever been. It is not enough to set a 2050 target and then wait, decades to begin the work. Emissions reductions now have an amplified effect. They're even more powerful than reducing emissions in the future. So it's so important that we put the tools in the hands of the folks that are in a position to get the job done. And that's exactly what we're doing at my company.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad you framed this as an emergency. We are in a crisis, but again, you're looking at what we can do and what we can do right now. And you just said that if companies are reducing their carbon emissions now, that has a really big effect. So there is hope here.
There's absolutely hope. I wake up with this every day, as many of us do. This is my life's work. But you can see I'm here, I'm in my energy, I'm in my joy. And it is because, Danny, it really is a privilege to be living in this window of time when we actually have the ability to enact the most sweeping changes that we need in order to stave off the worst of what will happen as the planet begins to rise. Meaning that if we do it right, we get the benefit of looking back and understanding that we were part of the solution. And for me, there's no greater joy that I could imagine than being able to say, when I'm on my dying day, that I was a part of the solution that helped to preserve our home planet for future generations.
That makes me really emotional, that it is a privilege to be working and doing these kinds of things during this time in history, because we can make change. And I think, so many Spelman students are a part of that change, and so many of them are being trained to be a part of the hope that you and others have been so good about, getting out into the world. Julia, the second theme that I wanted to talk to you about is how. Because a lot of businesses, are not on the same page as Planet Forward. And how do we encourage the private sector to take this on when they have shareholders that are probably much more short-sighted than they should be? What is the how of how we do that and invest in justice and influence better policies?
I'm going to talk about the how in three quick lenses, right, across sort of three different personas. So how can we as individuals take action? It's often surprising to learn that more than 60% of global emissions come from household use. We're always thinking about transportation and energy and manufacturing. Of course, there's no silver bullet to the climate crisis. We have to work across all sectors, but so much of what needs to happen happens at home. And so as individuals, what we can declare to ourselves is that we will become carbon neutral, that we will become climatarians is the word that I use, right? Climatarians, people who make our food and our lifestyle choices with the planet center plate, right? So become a climatarian. That's the best thing you can do as an individual. And then if you are in a position, and Spelman with its resources, with its reach, with its network to influence policy, then we have to demand carbon transparency for every single company on the planet. Every company should be required to let its stakeholders know what it's emitting. right? No company should be able to operate outside of the bounds of the public's purview to understand how they're influencing climate change. So demanding that legislation be enacted, and we're seeing little bits of this happening in California, even at the SEC level. And then finally, at the company level, and again, everyone in this room has the ability to influence companies. Imagine if we all right now tweeted our favorite retailer. What if we all tweeted Target and said, we demand that you go carbon neutral? Imagine the influence that would have. And so what we really need to do is be encouraging our companies, that every food, fashion, beauty, every company, every consumer company, to go carbon neutral. And those are three of the things that we can do right now. And I'm telling you what, if we do those things, we will get the job done.
I love it that you frame it that way. Again, it goes back to being hopeful. And, I hope that we all consider ourselves climatarians. And at this stage, young people have immense power because they want to know more about where their food comes from. They want that transparency and traceability that you've talked about. So there's a real opportunity right here, right now.
100%. And I think Dr. Jackson said this earlier in the conversation, but we are activists, right? I am an entrepreneur. I'm a CEO of my company, but at my core, I'm about taking action.
Right.
And I'm not just about building one company or one product or one technology. I'm about building a movement. And so I think the antidote to climate doom is activism. The antidote to feeling a sense of dread is to get busy. And if we all do that, I'm telling you, we'll get the job done.
I love it. We all need to get busy. And I love that this is about activation, that we can all do something on so many different levels. And so finally, Julia, I want to talk about what's next. What hasn't been solved in the private sector? And we'll hear from others today who can talk about this too. But what can food companies that are interested in really, living their values, being mission driven, what can they do? What needs to be happening? And again, this is such a unique moment in history. We have this ability to turn the Titanic around in so many respects, but how do we do it?
I think one of the first things that every company needs to do, and this is not just food companies, this is all companies, is engage your stakeholders. Listen to the folks who are buying your products. Listen to this incredible community at Spelman, because your stakeholders often have the answers, right? So the first is to listen. And the second thing I would say is we have to all be on a path toward decarbonization. It can't be something that we wait until 2050 to do. Decarbonization, we have to reduce emissions. There are not enough offsets on the planet for us to be able to offset our way out of the climate emergency. We have to decarbonize by really reducing emissions, right? And so anyone who's in a position to influence product development, supply chain, anyone who's in that position, anyone who's in a sustainability role or an operating role, really does have a responsibility to make that a priority.
Absolutely. So I think the listening part is so key. Companies really need to listen to eaters, to all of us who are consumers. So Julia, my final question for you, so many students and alum are watching who have been inspired by you and other folks working in this space. What advice, what is one thing that they can do tonight or tomorrow besides tweeting Target or another corporation to really be part of this activation, this movement?
I mean, I would consider, take an inventory of where you are really strong, right? If you are a writer, then go and write. If you are an organizer, then organize people. If you are an engineer, then come and work with Riana, Lynn, or come and work with Julia Collins. Go and find a talented entrepreneur who's building a scalable solution to addressing climate change and put that talent to work. If you are somebody who's a social media influencer, then tonight, create a Go Carbon Neutral tag. Each of us has a place or a couple of places where we are uniquely strong. And so there's no sort of one place where we can have an impact. It really is matching the place where you experience strength to what the movement needs. And I'm telling you, this movement needs amazing innovators in all areas.
Absolutely. Julia, you're one of my many heroines. I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you, Danny. So great talking to you, as always.
As always. Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.
It's now my pleasure to introduce someone I've admired for a long time, and that's Rose Scott. Rose is an award-winning journalist and the host of the midday news program Closer Look, heard on Atlanta's NPR station 90.1 FM WABE. Rose, thank you so much for being here and moderating these three incredible women on a discussion around roots, resilience, and reclamation. Thanks so much, Rose. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Danielle. It's always a pleasure to have another journalist on the panel so that people don't blame me for a question they don't like. But thank you so much. And there's so much to unpack from the conversation that we just heard that's going to lead into ours. Hello, everyone. As she just said, I am Rose Scott, and I'm deeply honored to be a part of this event. We're focused with Black women, food scholars. They call them global change agents, and I call them ambassadors and sister warriors, and all with the mission, as we hear, about preserving African roots and agriculture using artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about using that to resist traditional food production practices, and reclaiming and also retaining stolen land. That's important, stolen land from Black farmers. And I think I don't need to tell this audience, but we all know the intersection when it comes to civil rights and social justice organizations. We call it food justice right now, but this has been going on for a long time, since emancipation. And what history will tell us is that folks like Marcus Garvey, who looked up to Booker T. Washington, and how they were committed to using agriculture in the form of what we call industrial farming. This was important back then because we were called Negroes. This was important in terms of elevating and giving the Negro back then the sense of wealth and a way and a pathway to wealth. So this is nothing new. We're just going to talk about how now we do it in the 21st century. And I'm so excited to be joined by these, I call them sister warriors. I hope that's okay. And I'm going to let each of them sort of take you into what they do. But we have Gabrielle Carter, Riana Lynn, and Tracy Lord McCurdy. And reminder, we're not going to wait till the end of the conversation to get some of your questions in. Y'all know how I do, who listen to me here in Atlanta. I'm going to invite you all to be part of the conversation. Drop your question in the Q&A and we'll get to it. So on that note, I'm going to start with Gabrielle and just real quickly sort of take the audience through the current space that you work in as it relates to food or agriculture.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, okay, cool. Well, thank you for having me. A little bit about myself. I am an artist and a cultural preservationist. I use food as a vehicle to tell stories about our ancestors, about our elders, and create ways to reimagine wealth and having access to what we need now. I am based in Apex, North Carolina, which is where my family has been for a few generations. And I returned home in 2018 to learn how to grow my own food, to learn how to keep this land. And so I've been working on familial land and will be the link to keep agriculture going for my family because my mother's generation was removed from it. So it's an honor to be here and to hold some of that mantle. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. As you see, my background is one of my favorite people, scaling my Uncle Herbert's grape arbor. So this is my Uncle Andrew, who taught me how to make wine. And this was my first time making wine with him. And so we were climbing up in that massive arbor to collect grapes. And so I thought that felt like a good background for today.
All right, that's all right. Riana, tell the audience sort of the space that you work. I'm fascinated by this. I can't wait to get more into it.
No, I'm still incredibly grateful to be here today and listen to the conversations and introductions. What an honor to join both Dr. Jackson, Dr. Schmidt Campbell, as they represent such groundbreaking research and community building out of Spelman, and also, of course, Daniel Nuremberg and Food Tank. I represent, as we have seen, and as I would love to discuss today, sort of the neoscience in food. I trained and have a background in biology and genetics. And when I started my first food company, about 11 years ago, my goal was to find ways to help impact our nutrition and our health. Since then, I've worked both in science and policy and in private technology at Google. And what's most important about what we do today and what I come to think about when we talk about resistance in the food movement is the right for us to not only bear creativity, bear ingenuity, but what that means for mostly the history of Black scientists in food and food development. When I think of resistance, and when I was asked to talk about resistance today, when I think of myself as a scientist, as a Black woman, as a queer woman, as a third generation food builder, I think about the process to create and protect and really provide for ourselves within food systems. And I want to go into how we can do that with data and AI, but most importantly, as we build together collaboratively, and we think about how we can all be a part of innovation. I love what Julia said earlier around building our own strengths, but we have to make sure that we come together to continue to bear resistance in arms in our well-being. And I represent a company that now works with some of the world's biggest food companies across the world. And we really look at packaged food. We really don't go after like fresh restaurants or sort of fresh home delivery. We think about the big 70%, as we call it. That's 70% of our daily caloric intake is processed packaged foods. It's a $3 trillion industry, and it's grown quite significantly over the past 70 years as capitalism and industrialization has taken over our right to resist and manage our own food. And I love to talk about how the theme of roots and reclamation and resistance can really help us power our own well-being and our own ownership and our overall health within the food system.
All right, we're going to get into that as well. Tracy. Unmute for us, Tracy.
Grand Rising, beloved community. I am really energized to be a part of the Community Cipher today and to talk about how our work to cancel this unconscionable debt that has shackled thousands of Black farmers, how our efforts to cancel the debt and to bring about restorative land justice for our Black farmers is centered in this theme of reclamation. This year is the 25th anniversary of the Pigford v. Glickman class action racial discrimination lawsuit that left thousands of Black farmers in unconscionable debt, farm foreclosures, and no legal recourse to save their land. Now, how did this happen? We often talk about the Pigford lawsuit as being the largest, most historic class action racial discrimination lawsuit. However, due to attorney malpractice, incompetence, the aggressive posture of the DOJ, the Department of Justice against Black farmers, only 4.8% of the $1 billion settlement went to debt cancellation. And so I want to lift up the story of Elder Bernard Bates, because he really carries the spirit of reclamation in his life. Elder Bates transitioned in January. He was 85 years old. He was a descendant of our North Star in the Black agrarian community, Nicodemus, Kansas. His grandfather acquired 250 acres in Nicodemus, and he was able to build on that land holding and amass 950 acres of land. Due to anti-Black racism, the land started to come under threat. And so he wrote President Ronald Reagan back in 1983 about the discrimination he had encountered. And President Ronald Reagan responded with dismantling the Office of Civil Rights, the very arm charged with investigating discrimination complaints. Consequently, Elder Bates lost all 950 acres of land, and he has participated in our efforts at debt cancellation. And 3 days before he ascended to the land of the ancestors, he spoke to another farmer. We call her the Pickford historian. She's from Alabama, Bernice Atchison. And he said, Queen Mother, I'm not going to be able to hold on. I thought I would be able to hold on to see justice, but I'm not going to be able to. And so I want you to continue to fight and for you never to give up fighting. And so when we talk about the devastation of the Black agricultural land base, we see that with respect to the debt cancellation program that has currently been halted due to allegations of reverse discrimination. I think it's important to note that the white farmers that filed those lawsuits, many of them received over $500,000 in subsidies. Their counties received billions in subsidies. So we know that it was fictitious and a racist allegation. Most of the land holdings, 98% of the land is owned by European Americans. They receive over 99% of their subsidies. Black farmers comprise less than 2% of the agrarian land base. And I think it's important to note with the debt cancellation, when we first started out in our efforts, Rose, we were under the belief that there were 17,000 Black farmers that would benefit from debt cancellation. In actuality, after the American Rescue Plan Act passed, we learned that it was only 25,000 African-American farmers out of the 22,000 self-identifying BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, that were eligible for debt cancellation. That's less than 8% of all Black farmers. And so we are really pushing, when we talk about reclamation, we're really pushing because we fought tirelessly in the American Rescue Plan Act to secure $1 billion to help restore the agricultural land bases for farmers of color. And we're waiting for that aspect to be implemented. The critical piece is the direct payments to Black farmers. So I look forward to going further into the work as the conversation progresses.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to Riana with this, and I'll start with her because before we even take that deeper dive into some specifics, what it is about this moment in terms of not just the broad food and agricultural justice and equity movement that we're all in, but as a civil and human rights issue, how critical is it now that we talk about actionable outcomes and then relate this to the pandemic? You hear people say, well, if we don't do it now, we'll never have any progress. Riana, I'll start with you.
No, absolutely. I think over the past 2 years, we've seen a tremendous growth, unfortunately, and the way that and change in the way that we access food and the impact of supply chains for our food and the way that we order packaged foods. More than ever, people were relying upon things like Instacart and Amazon to get bulk foods. And this has had a tremendous effect on not only the environment, but also the ways that we feel secure and how we access, our daily food outcomes. And over the past few years, we've also seen a tremendous growth and impact in food, not only food waste systems, but also in food community centers that house and support, our most hungered individuals across the country. Before the pandemic, 1 in 8 every day went hungry in most communities. That number is down to close to 1 in 6, or has risen now to almost 1 in 6 in every American across the country. And so we have to find ways not only to solve for a lot of the supply chain issues that are really critical that we're now starting to understand, but also to figure out if there are ways that our community can build very actionable solutions that help support not only the entrepreneurs that are most affected and most marginalized within our Black communities especially, but also to make sure that we understand that the Black health, Black nutrition, the nutrition of Black women and mothers is really critical and important, and probably not only the most ostracized, but also the most forgotten in terms of the fight that we have right now. We're on the brink of potentially a recession, and we must make sure that we're building solutions that thinks about all of these communities, and also that we're collaborating in a way where the food companies, that run most of the food that we consume today across the grocery stores and the ways that we traditionally access food, are bringing the voices that we have here today, the voices that are listening and participating to the table when we design our food and when we design our food systems. And when we think about what we build at Journey Foods, we really like to provide actionable data that not only says, we need to create something healthier, something that is tasty, something that is accessible, something that's affordable, but we need to also look and make sure that we can provide the logistics behind it. We need to make sure that we're looking at both communities, most rural as well as most city adjacent and urban adjacent, so that we can access and give them and provide what they need. And the only way that we're going to do this is if we think that everyone around our food system has a voice and has some say in how we design in the future.
All right, thank you. Gabrielle, this moment now and how important it is, and how the pandemic, although some people say is amplifying all these inequities and disparities like they didn't know they existed, but here we are. So why is this moment so critical now?
Yeah, I think I love what you were saying, Riana, about like community-based solutions, because that's what I come from, right? That's what a lot of us come from. We come from communities who have women and men who they see a problem and they get together and they have meetings and they talk about, okay, well, here's the issue. How are we going to tackle it as a community? It's beautiful to, as someone who started or helped start a CSA at the top of the pandemic that works with Black farmers, it's been a beautiful process to see how, all they needed was a vehicle, right? We already have a lot of Black farmers in the communities growing food. It's a matter of visibility. It's a matter of accessibility. And so being able to be a part of a CSA that brings that visibility where there might not be that, especially when at the beginning of the pandemic, when a lot of farmers markets and different places were closed down and that wasn't even an option. But just thinking like our ancestors thought about this thing, okay, what really the question is, what's the package we're putting the food in? Because we're dropping it off on doorsteps if we have to. And I love being from a place where that's how we problem solve. We come together, we make sure we identify the actual problem, because I think also the mainstream will tell you what the problem is, but your community has its own like subset of problems and issues and things that are impacting the elders differently than it's impacting the youth. And so it's important to have that communication and to be able to identify what the actual issues are and then bring what you have to the table. I may not have a lot of money, but I have some social capital. I have some visibility. I have, I'm great at, I can build a website, like what do we have? What are our gifts and how do we come together to build something that will really serve us? And I'm just honored to be a part of something that does that on some level.
Well, Tracy, I want you to start then this next round of conversation, because this is not something that this nation can legislate itself out of, or is it, along with partnerships? In other words, the solutions, are they have policy based? Are they community, private, public partnerships? Through your lens, where does it begin?
I thank you for that question, Rose. I wanted to share my family's land story. Similar to Gabrielle, my great-great-grandmother was a sharecropper in Eastern North Carolina and became an independent farmer who acquired 30 acres of land with my grandfather, Gordon Webb. My great-great-grandmother is Lizzie Webb. And the land has remained in the family for 6 generations as Black family land. Now, I want to compare that when we talk about the colonial origin of debt. I want to compare that to the land memory of George Floyd. George Floyd's great-great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart Sr., was born into slavery. At the end of slavery, he acquired over 500 acres of land, also in North Carolina. And due to white collusion and criminality, he lost all 500 acres of land. George Floyd's grandparents toiled as sharecroppers, and they were never able to acquire land because of the cycle of debt that is inherent in the system. And so I think it's really important when we talk about our advocacy efforts to cancel the debt. This is a relic of the plantation economy, both debt being used as a racialized tool of oppression, but also the 30 billion Commodity Credit Corporation Fund that also has racist origins. It was established in 1933, and it undergirded and supported mostly white landowners at the exclusion of our tenant farming ancestors. Mm-hmm. That wealth disparity exists today. So when we talk about our advocacy efforts, back in 2020, our coalition met with the Biden-Harris transition team. And at the time, we were talking about federal agricultural policies that would really address the crisis of Black farming today. We talked about immediate foreclosure moratorium. Many of our Pickford legacy farmers have been foreclosed on over the last 25 years. And because of the debt not being canceled, for example, the sugarcane farmers in New Iberia, back in 1999, their debt was $500,000. Now it's ballooned to 1.6 million. Mm-hmm. We also talked about, of course, the debt cancellation, the direct payments for past discrimination. And then lastly, we talked about a perpetual allocation in the Commodity Credit Corporation Fund. It's a $30 billion fund that, again, has undergirded the white farming land base, and we want a perpetual allocation to restore the Black agricultural land base. Mm-hmm. Now, the response from Secretary Vilsack, who was the senior advisor to the Biden-Harris transition team, was the establishment of an equity commission. Mm-hmm. We immediately rejected that because we thought that that recommendation was misguided, considering the fact that USDA has failed to implement the recommendations from the Civil Rights Action Team report from 1997, the precursor to the Pickford lawsuit. None of those recommendations have ever been implemented. Mm-hmm. So why would we spend $10 million on performative justice when we could implement these policy recommendations and it would immediately alleviate the suffering of Black mm-hmm. farmers?
So in other words, if I can take all that, it could take some legislation to help out, but we ain't getting it, is in a sense what you're saying.
Yeah, we've tried everything. I mean, over the last 25 years, Black farmers have been fighting, representing themselves pro se in federal court to no relief. Then we worked with Senator Elizabeth Warren on this robust policy platform to dismantle institutional discrimination, which led to the Justice for Black Farmers Act with Senator Cory Booker, which we couldn't garner the 60 votes for it to pass. And so that's how we cobbled together the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act to provide debt cancellation for all farmers of color. And then it was challenged in the federal courts again due to allegations of reverse discrimination.
Well, I tell you what, Tracy, we're going to continue this conversation definitely on Closer Look on my programs, because I know you got a whole lot. And as someone just said, this is quite disturbing. And how do we then address this? But I want to move something else real quickly. I want to get to Riana for a second, because you talked about, look, there's innovation involved in this too. There's a solution as it relates to innovation, science, and technology. And in this food, in this production space that you work in, for our listener, for our virtual audience that may not know this, what is that connection to what Tracy just talked about in terms of advancing the culture in the community, and then what you do with science and technology? Do they correlate? Can they go hand in hand?
Well, I mean, absolutely. When we think about one, I love how much history Tracy brings in the conversation. When I think about what I do today with Journey Foods and with data and food production, and where there's been the loss of Black history and Black ownership and Black innovation in food science and food production. I mean, we have, the modern sugar process was created by a Black man. The ways that we look, the first PhD in chemistry, and I think Dr. Jackson, of course, can speak, very broadly on this woman, but the first woman, a Black woman to get a PhD in chemistry also led multiple studies on how we think about food and how food affects everything from chronic disease to heart disease to our blood pressure and diabetes today, and led the groundwork for that. And so when we think about so many people that we don't typically tell the stories of when it comes to food innovation, food ownership, and sort of processing of our agriculture and processing of the land that we were, tilling and sharecropping on, and what we have today with, innovators in food manufacturing, like in Atlanta, Pinky Cole, and, Julia Collins with Moonshot Snacks, and what we provide at Journey Foods. I think we need to continually look at the parallel opportunities in owning our food stories and knowing that food is not one size fits all. When I started my food journey as a biologist and geneticist, I was studying nutrition genetics, and how the fact that most of the food that we develop today in modern food manufacturing is built for the white diet, built for the white body. And lots of that has turned into inflammation and chronic disease that many of us are facing, no matter your socioeconomic status as a Black consumer, as a Black eater. And the same practices and the same loss of that ownership in food production and land ownership and agriculture are the same things that we must look at when it comes to resistance in this space. And what I love about what Spelman's doing as well is that we're building ecosystems of innovation and entrepreneurship so that we can continue to come in. And I think that, unfortunately, land ownership and agriculture will never be the same again, as we need to look at things like vertical farming, indoor farming, and other ways to bring that to the Black community and own careers in agriculture. But we also know that we have a bigger opportunity than ever before to be both scientists and food producers and food owners, and own 100% of the food companies that we can consume and put out into our communities today.
Now I want to take what you've said and what Tracy said before. And so Gabrielle here comes in. It sounds like we got to know our history. Let's take the knowledge that we're gaining from history, doing what Riana's doing. But then there is another missing link here, and that is, how did we make sure that this resonates with the next generation or the future generation? Because Gabrielle, you're a masterful creative when it comes to food storytelling, making this connection to Black folks and history and tradition. But we got to make sure it resonates, because everything that Tracy's fighting for and what Riana's trying to do in terms of using new and sustainable and innovative approaches, we got to let this next generation know. How do we do that? How do we resonate that with them? Besides taking away their smartphone and tablet.
Well, no, I think that's a part of it, right? I love being able to tell story through digital content, right? That's one of my mediums. I love these vignettes where you get to spend some time in the garden with someone that you may not have had access to. I feel like that is something that TikTok and Instagram creates kind of pathways to, right? And I try and use those, well, I say those, but I haven't gotten TikTok yet. I try and use Instagram, at least, as a platform to connect younger folks to some of that storytelling. But I think a part of that conversation is too, what are the stories that we're telling, and what are the stories that are important to pull forward? And what's really exciting about this moment is, being in the room with the geneticist, being in the room with scientists. It's really important that these conversations are happening across scientists and backyard gardeners and farmers and growers. And it's important that we're all having these conversations together, because so much can be lost when certain groups of people are excluded. And so I think, I was recently in a part of this group where it's called the Heirloom Collard Project, and they have been archiving heirloom collards now, I believe for around 5 or 6 years. But the originators of this group were white folk, and they did this beautiful book about collards that tells a really cool story about the heritage and the history. But unfortunately, there weren't many Black voices involved in that book. And so, that's for many reasons, right? Like, who's at the table and who are you asking the questions to, and how are you finding the farmers and how are you finding the growers? But also there's like this conversation around not having access to seed, right? Because it has to be grown for a certain period of time to be considered heirloom. But if people are disrupted and displaced, sorry, y'all, my mom is trying to get in the house and not disrupt. I'm like, come in. When people are displaced, sometimes those seeds become lost, and that story and that legacy and that history and all the things that come with the taste of those collards or the taste of that crop, and the stories and the identity that we associate with those crops, that gets lost too. So it's exciting to have an opportunity to bring us all kind of together to archive those stories and find ways to make content interesting enough for young folks to want to also continue to pull it forward.
And I want to ask everybody out there, I can't see you, but raise your hand or let me know if you have picked some collards, snapped some peas, and made some cornbread with crackling. That's all I'm gonna say. But I'm also going to ditch my questions because we have so many great questions in our Q&A. And I think that's the best way to bring the community in there, and y'all just jump in there. Here's the first question. Can we make change in our existing industrial food system? Often it seems that it just needs to be taken down and we need to start over. Riana, I think that might be yours. What you think?
I absolutely wish we could take over. The reason why we do what we do at Journey Foods and why we're having conversations like these are because we need to feed, over 300 million people every day, multiple times a day here in the US. We need to feed close to 8 billion people globally across the world. And modern food system is really in its nascent stages. It really dates back to sort of post World War II, where we start moving food production from our homes and from our own small gardens and farms into, modern day grocery stores. And so we've had to rapidly innovate and create packaged, shelf-stable foods with this rapid, population growth and change in sort of how our families operate economically. And we are now trying to figure out how to reverse a lot of that change in growth. There's only one food scientist and food technologist for every 40,000 people that exist across this world. So you can imagine that there's crazy amounts of inequities and errors when it comes to the production of food, especially for Black communities, as most of those people that are creating our foods or leading the companies that are globally distributing foods for us don't look like us. And so the best thing that we can do today is continue to not only build the companies with people that represent all of us, but also to use as much data as possible, because otherwise we have, very limited resources and understanding in how we can feed 8 billion people, especially as packaged and processed foods become more of the standard within our daily diets.
And Riana, I think you should get this one too, because it was based on something that you said, and it's from I hope I get the name right, Aisha. She says, can you expand more on how food production is based on the white diet?
I shared a little bit of notes here. I don't want to take up too much time, but thinking on more of a nutrition genetic scope, the diets that existed, not just for Black Americans in the US, but for most Americans just 100 years ago, were vastly different to the diets that we have today. Today, food production is really built around shelf stability, efficiency, low cost. And so we're doing things like overproducing gluten. We have a monocrop system where we're feeding, the chickens and the cows that we're consuming all the time, or the dairy milk that is coming from them, through a monocrop corn system, right? And so we have these sort of quick, fast, cheap solutions that have been developed into our modern food system to feed all of us. And most divergent from the Black or the African diet is what we consume today and what we're told to consume, both off of like the USDA plate standards, but also from what exists in most of the grocery stores that we have access to now. And so if we don't take the power back and understanding like what is the best diet genetically for us or for our communities, and who and which companies are building those foods, and how can we support those companies to building foods affordably? Because unfortunately, with the supply chain issues, with crop subsidies, among other things, some of the biggest companies win, and we end up thinking that the healthiest foods are the most expensive, when there's definitely opportunities within the supply chain to support smaller companies, more innovative, biodiverse companies with better products for us that match more of the traditional diets that we had 100 years ago. And I think those are the ways that we have to think about more of a white lens on the diets and the food production that's affecting, what I say is the number one cause of death across the world and across the US. And those are chronic diseases, diabetes, obesity, mental health diseases, cancers. And we can really take control of that if we supported more of our innovators in the space.
I want to get this. Thank you for that, Rihanna. I want to get this to Tracy, because Tracy got folks engaged talking about the plight of our Black and brown farmers. And this is from Perry. Perry says, given the lack of interest of those in power in supporting Black farmers, how can those seeking justice for Black farmers gain traction for the community during the 2023 Farm Bill discussions and negotiations? Tracy.
Well, my grandmother, she was always fond of saying, always be Brer Rabbit, right? And so when the Justice for Black Farmers Act turned to ash because we couldn't generate the 60 votes, we looked at budget reconciliation. So we don't have to wait every 5 years for the Farm Bill. And so in the first budget reconciliation, the American Rescue Plan Act, we were Brer Rabbit, we were Nazi the Spider, and we were able to get debt cancellation in budget reconciliation. Now, what has happened is the lawsuit. I remember the week before the payments were supposed to go out, I called one of the elders, Lloyd Wright, he's the former director of civil rights, and I was drinking my wine, and I'm like, we did it. And he said, I'm not drinking yet, not until the check gets into the hands of Black farmers. And then the lawsuits happened, and I was devastated. And so one of the other things that he shared, and it was a very difficult truth for me, and I'm still wrestling with it. He said, this was after we started working on restorative language in the Build Back Better Act. And it was more race neutral language. However, that process was somewhat hijacked with other interests. And so the reality with the Build Back Better Act, it centered white farmers. The vast majority of the debt cancellation would go to economically distressed farmers. And that was very difficult for me. And I remember talking to Lloyd Wright about it, and he said, you can get upset, but at some point, you're going to have to accept the fact that in order for Black farmers to get anything in this country, white farmers have to get the lion's share and have to be centered. That's very difficult for me to accept as an idealist. But I think that is the learning lesson with the Build Back Better Act, which currently died in the Senate. And so we're activating other packages that could possibly be a legislative remedy with debt cancellation. That's currently being considered now. I think it's really important, though. There's $1 billion fund right now that was provided in the American Rescue Plan Act. Now, Professor William Darity at Duke University talks about what is owed to Black farmers.
And I have the book. I have the book in
You
reparations.
have it.
I got the big book right back there. Yeah, I got it.
350 billion up to $1 trillion. So to be clear, 1 billion is just a small piece on our long road to restorative land justice. But I think that we have to put pressure. Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock wrote Secretary Vilsack in December asking about what is the plan for the $1 billion. And I think we just received a letter from Secretary Vilsack, our coalition today, and we're going to share it with beloved community regarding the plan for that $1 billion. And so what I would say is we don't have to wait until the Farm Bill. Now, I mean, we can't wait every 5 years. And so we have to be creative. And I love what Gabrielle and Riana said. I mean, with our coalition, we've activated the fiber artists and the heritage quilters. You know, Tony K. Bambara said the role of the cultural worker is to make the revolution irresistible. And so we carry that in our work. We worked with the hip hop group from the South Carolina Low Country Native Son, and they did a concert film for us. We worked with poets. I mean, we really have to have a multi-disciplinary approach to dismantling anti-Black racism within USDA. And so I think oftentimes we have to activate other aspects, you know, the other magic in the community, because the law is not the sharpest tool. Audre Lorde told us that it's not the sharpest tool at all.
As my grandma would say, she sure did. Gabrielle, I have a question here in terms of and what Tracy has talked about, and it goes back to community. As the person who asked the question about, well, if the powers that be aren't paying attention, how do we get community involved? Because sometimes, as you know, we saw this, right? We've been seeing this for the last 60 some years. Civil rights movement, it did make some progress. So we got to get the community involved. How do we do that?
Yes, I think being with people, be with people, you know, you got to know your community to have them rally around you, to rally around these ideas. We have to spend time, and we have to show people that their visions and their ideas and their solutions are valid too and important, and make space for them to share. And so I think that's kind of what initially comes to mind. It's just kind of, you know, in order to do it, you got to be with them first.
Absolutely. And I was someone that wanted to know the name of the book. The name of the book is From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. It's written by Professor Darty and his wife, Kirsten Mullen. So definitely check that out. And I think you all should get that. It's fascinating. It's not just about writing a check to Black folks, as some people think that's what all reparations is about, because it ain't about that. Before I invite Danielle and Julia back in, I want to get one more question in. Someone wants to know, they want to learn how to resist in a more practical way as far as it relates to food. Who wants to tackle that? I want to learn how to resist in a more practical way as far as it relates to food.
May I?
Go ahead, Gabrielle, get it.
Oh, no.
I can all answer that.
Go ahead. Yeah, there's some great answers in the chat. I mean, there's some people have said things like growing and, you know, bringing more of our food closer to our homes, which is a great way. There's a lot more tools available now to grow our own food, even in the smallest of apartments. I think we also have seen an abundance, and we'll see an abundance, and I'm really proud of the growth of Black women running food companies. And I hope to see international food companies, not just national food companies. And so let's continue to support and crowdfund and build community around Black women that are developing food companies in our grocery stores, restaurants, and farms as well. And I think the resistance is really in the ownership of our well-being and also our own supply chains.
I want to invite Danielle and Julia back into the conversation as well, because we may have some questions or comments for them. I want to talk about, this comes from, it says more context. San Francisco is the most restaurant dense city in the world. Black people comprise less than 5% of the population, and this is reflected in the small number of Black-owned restaurants in the area. The way that Black food is depicted has mostly been fried Southern food. This is a long question. Distinctly missing the soul of the African diaspora food traditions. How can we change how we consume when we have been isolated from our agricultural roots and community ties for so long? And I see Tracy over there. I'm gonna let you have it. You got that? How can we change how we consume when we have been isolated from our agricultural roots and community ties for so long? And I'm wondering if you think that that's actually true. Have we been isolated from our roots and our community ties?
If so, it was because of, again, federal policy rooted in anti-Black racism. And so for us to be reconnected to the land, it is through the eradication of anti-Black racism in the USDA, the local FSA offices, and the county committee system. So for example, there is a foreclosure moratorium in effect right now. There are not supposed to be any adverse actions taken against any Black farmer or farmers of color due to debt delinquencies. However, in Georgia, there were several cases where the local FSA offices were sending letters out to Black farmers stating that due to the delinquency and debt, that they were going to accelerate their debt, their loans, and then they were initiating foreclosure proceedings. How does this happen when there is a foreclosure moratorium in effect? This is how I call it the rot of anti-Black racism. USDA also through the local offices, mind you, there is still a foreclosure moratorium in effect. When the farmers were preparing to sell their peanuts or their soybeans or cotton, USDA, because of this debt, through these local rogue FSA offices, were intercepting those payments and stating that those payments needed to go towards the debt. So this is the history. And I think oftentimes we don't make the connection of how devastating this issue of debt has been. One of the Pigford luminaries, her name is Gladys Todd from Zebulon, North Carolina. So many luminaries from North Carolina. I went to North Carolina A&T. And one of the professors there, Professor Donald McDowell, back in 1999, he stated that in order for Black farmers to re-enter agriculture, that the payments to Black farmers had to be at least $250,000. They disregarded his recommendation. He was an ag economics professor at North Carolina A&T. And instead, the cash payments were $50,000 that were based on the payments made to the Tuskegee experiment survivors. They received $37,500. So when we talk about how can we restore the Black agricultural land base and have thriving farms, we need land. We need land access. There's so many landless farmers. We need to eradicate the debt. And then we have to go back. I call it restorative land justice. We have the Commodity Credit Corporation Fund. It's a $30 billion fund. I don't support the idea of more loans, even if they're non-extractive. I feel that our community has been so decimated due to anti-Black racism that we need investment in infrastructure. That's what we were advocating for with the $1 billion in direct payments. And so similarly, recently, Secretary Vilsack took out $1 billion in the Commodity Credit Corporation Fund for climate smart agriculture. There is money set aside for pilot initiatives. And so this is an opportunity for the Black agrarian community to look at hemp production, acquiring a hemp processing facility, and just really standing in our imaginations. So it's limitless potential, but we have to be organized and focused on the Commodity Credit Corporation, because that is what has undergirded and supported the white farmer land base. And so in the interest of equity and reparations, we should demand a perpetual allocation out of this $30 billion fund that is inexhaustible and that is always renewed.
Gotcha. By the way, this is just me. If you are going to order that book online, could you get it from a Black-owned bookstore? I'm just saying. I know we put the Amazon. I know we put the Amazon link in there, but I'm just saying, just maybe Google and find a Black-owned bookstore. This question comes from Caitlin, who says, what can white allies do to support these movements? And we all know about allies in 2020, but I keep telling y'all, I'm going to write a book that says when woke folk fall asleep, and that could be of whatever color. So we're talking about allies. So let's talk about allies. Who wants to tackle that?
I think we're not just looking for allies, we're looking for accomplices. We're not just looking for passive people who are going to sort of pat us on the back as we engage in the struggle. We're looking for people who are going to actively trade their privilege to move the ball forward. And I think what it takes to be an accomplice is to understand where you experience privilege, and then not just be willing, but be excited about trading that privilege to create more equity for those around you.
And as a journalist, it starts with listening, right, Julia? You have to listen.
100%. You have to listen before you can attempt and to sit in the discomfort and to be willing to sit in that uncomfortable place for as long as it takes for you to even begin to think, to form an opinion. And that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Here's a question, which I think is very important. I'm glad somebody typed this. What role can the medical community play in bringing food justice? And I imagine it's this whole conversation. Who wants to take that? Danielle, Riana?
I can jump in there. I mean, the history of food as medicine, particularly in the Black community, is about 200 years old today. If we go back to sort of the history of, pharmacology or natural pharma in the Black community through Gullah tribes. And I think one thing that is most disjointed today is that our health practitioners, our primary care physicians, do not study food and food as medicine in the way that they should through formal training. And they have to take the time out to go train personally and sit with communities to understand the biggest challenges when it comes to behavior, right? We tell people to eat better, and that's not easy. That's not easy at all. That's why I became an entrepreneur, because we have to just build better food, but our doctors have to be willing to learn through different mediums, to learn outside of medical school, to practice and have these conversations with us, especially on the food side, to build the toolkits that help us understand exactly how much health is and food is affecting, and will keep us away from maybe even their pockets. Like Julia just said, sit in and listen and sit in that discomfort. Doctors have to be uncomfortable with the fact that, like, if we eat better, if we build better food systems, we're going to spend a lot less time with them, and they probably and hopefully make a lot less money.
Well, and this is just me talking, because I have these conversations every day. Folks have to understand that even access to food, if you don't have an urban garden or if you don't have a garden, access to healthy food is a problem for folks. I can tell you there are a lot of Atlanta neighborhoods, and people in this virtual audience know I'm not lying. There are neighborhoods, one, that still don't have access to a farmer's market or to healthy food. And then you got mobility and transit issues. Okay. All that is intertwined together. And I know that's a whole nother show. So for my final question, I want to start with Danielle, because with what you all do at Food Tank and everything that everybody's talked about, all these, it takes a holistic approach. It takes collaboration. It takes this sector and this sector. Okay, we know that. Now here's that question. How then do we begin to get everybody at the table who should be at the table and who will be heard? Because everyone's got wonderful ideas and everybody's in wonderful spaces, but we got to bring everybody together. So Danielle, I'll let you start, and then we'll just go around the virtual room.
Thank you so much, Rose. And before I answer, you have done such an excellent job of moderating this very such a powerful discussion. I'm in awe of you and these women. I think we have to have more discussions like this one. And I want to commend Spelman for being willing to work with a white-led organization that wants to have these uncomfortable conversations. As Julia mentioned, we need to sit in the uncomfortableness and embrace it so that we can ensure that all folks who want to be at the table, who need to be at the table, are discussing these issues. And that has, there's been so much inequity, so much inherent racism, especially in our food and agriculture systems for so long. Now is the time to break that cycle. And we can all be activists and we can all be part of this to break that down. But we don't, as with climate justice and climate change and the crisis that we're facing in our healthcare systems and our biodiversity loss crisis, we cannot wait to do this next year or by 2050. We all have to do it now.
Julia.
One of the things I'm working on myself is to actively engage with people who hold very different views from me. And one of the things that's happened during the pandemic, and for me with increasing sort of time spent in social media, is I spend more and more time with folks who are already bought in, when actually what I need to be doing is getting other folks over the line. So something that we can all do is, for the next convening that we have like this, bring someone to the table who wouldn't normally get to participate in this kind of a conversation, and bring somebody to the table who might even have a high degree of skepticism, because that's where the change happens.
All right, Riana.
No, I love that. And I think, continuing on the theme of resistance and thinking about the fact that, traditionally Black women have been here to sort of save and protect, but we also are going to be the future of creation and innovation. I completely agree with you, Julia, and with gathering in this conversation. We won't solve this if we all don't think of ourselves as creators, if we don't think of ourselves as neoscientists, if we don't all think of ourselves as powerful pieces of this table. It's going to take years and lots of conversations and lots of funding and lots of creativity to change these systems. We do have that power, though, with that mindfulness and with that collaboration. And I see people coming in here and saying that they're life coaches and diabetes advocates and, Black farmers and caring about food deserts. I mean, we need to continue to make sure that we are all fighting in here together. And finally, one of the most limiting things are our resources. And we have to make sure that we're finding ways, as you mentioned, Rose, to spend your money at the Black bookstore. We have to continue to spend our money on each other and supporting and finding resources, because we can't wait on the law or the policy alone to get us across that finish line.
Absolutely. Gabrielle.
Yeah, I feel like I just want to echo everything that was said. I think bringing more people to the table that maybe wouldn't have come into the conversation unless they were asked with intention. I think trusting in like community ambassadors, people who have lived in a place, considering them experts too, listening to what they actually have to say and what they can offer to the conversation feels like a good place for us to start. And patience and consistency feel like some words that come up for me with this work. It's like, it's not an overnight thing, but you have to be willing to commit and show up. And even when you don't have the answers, to show up and just sit there and be quiet. So,
yeah. You can talk to our civil rights giants about, consistency. I mean, fighting for civil rights is not something that you just do for a couple of years. It's ongoing. Tracy.
One of the farmers that I mentioned earlier, Bernice Atchison, she said she tells her daughters, I gave you 2 feet to stand, that's your strength, and 2 wings to fly, that's your freedom. And one of the containers for our work is the African proverb, the axe forgets what the tree remembers. The axe forgets what the tree remembers. And so along this journey of debt cancellation, there was a young journalist, Black woman journalist, that heard one of our press events, and she was astounded. She didn't understand how USDA was offsetting Black farmers' Social Security, disability, subsidy payments, their tax refunds, even the little, a stimulus check of $200. One of the elders, Eddie Slaughter, he's a double amputee, blind in one eye, from Buena Vista, Georgia. And they garnished all of his subsidies, his disability payments, to the amount of $41,000 over 9 years. And so she heard that precedent. And so she started a fellowship with the Center for Public Integrity. And she's investigating the issue of debt offsets and how they've been used in a racialized manner, gone back 10 years. And that report is forthcoming. I mean, that's a body of work. When we talk about reparations, when that report comes out, it's going to be astounding. So that's how we activate the light in each other, you know, and we're committed to creating this massive tribe. And so I think that's what it is, you know, that we inspire each other with our own soul work towards collective liberation.
I love it. And Tracy, I have a lot of questions about the quilt behind you. Can you just take a minute and tell folks, because if I get one more question ask about the quilt, Rose. Okay, Tracy, talk about the quilt.
This quilt is over 20 years old, and it's from a quilt collective in Zimbabwe. And it's a story quilt. It's applique, and it actually tells the story of a farm family going to a midwife and building a family. So I get a lot of compliments on it, and a lot of our work is rooted in agrarian material culture. And so it feels, it envelops me and centers me on this journey.
All right, and it is not for sale, people. Tracy Lord McCurdy, Gabrielle Carter, Riana Lynn, Daniel Nierenberg, Julia Collins. Thank you all so much. What a fabulous conversation. We could have probably went another hour with this, and we probably should. And we should definitely come back and do this again. Thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you, panelists. What a wonderful conversation. What a wonderful evening tonight. I love some of the takeaways. We're all creators. We can all do something. We're all can be activists in this journey of solving the issues around the food ecosystem. Keep in mind, next year, we host this every year. This was our first year being virtual, but hopefully we'll be in person next year at Spelman College. And so I invite you next year around the same time to our Food Justice Symposium or Summit, if you're in the Atlanta area. And I'm hoping that Food Tank will collaborate with us again. Danny, are you standing by as we're...
I'm so ready to do this in person next year, Dr. Jackson. You have no idea, mostly just to give you a hug, but to have these wonderful conversations continue.
Yeah, so this is exciting. And the biggest takeaway for me is that we all have a talent, that we can do something around food justice, around the food ecosystem. So take your talent, use it, sit in it, figure it out, and we're going to all come together to solve the problems around food inequities, especially in the Black community. With that being said, good night to everyone. And I want to thank our big sponsor of the night, our generous sponsor, Kellogg, for helping us put on this fabulous event. You all have a wonderful evening.